Considering something like Jiri Trnka's The Hand, what limitations inspired such a film? How did the Communist Party enforce its ideals, and what were they? Ultimately, the state's choice would have an interesting effect on its cinema. Jiri Trnka's The Hand would represent an artist who was oppressed and who never got to fully express himself, along with other artists of his generation in the country. His work is a product of the oppression. The filmmakers of the Czech New Wave, however, would form as a result of oppression and limitations. Czechoslovak cinema under communist rule was used as a tool to promote state ideals through socialist realism, but the emergence of the Czech New Wave in the 1960s with its realistic and critical films mirrored the growing discontent and resistance among filmmakers and citizens against the regime's censorship and propaganda. But how did this all happen, and how did it come to be? One of the first steps Czechoslovakia took to promote state ideals through cinema and social realism was to create an army school. This army school is where they set the standard for their rigorous nationalized film industry, in which films that aligned with the party's ideals were created. The party viewed cinema as an agent that could be used to insinuate the prestigious and powerful role of the army. This was one of the first steps of enforcing the party's ideal on cinema. This military cinema aimed to illustrate the army and recognize it as a piece of the country's culture during a time of post-war reconstruction. One author details the goals of the army via the army school as building socialism. The format was increasingly discussed in terms of the Soviet model, the Communist Party's landmark 1950 directive regarding the creative task of Czechoslovak film toward a high ideological and artistic level of Czechoslovak cinema, a blueprint for party conceptions of the fiction feature at this moment, encapsulates this. Following the example of great Soviet film, it states Czechoslovak film must play an important role in the education of the new, mature citizen of the Republic, the devoted builder of socialism who loves his free country fervently and will resolutely defend it at any time against the attacks of enemies, and who is wedded by indestructible, and the format was increasingly discussed in terms of the Soviet model. By using Soviet film as a model, the party aimed for realism, socialist realism, that depicted the reality of the people while embodying a spirit of socialism. This also meant that the party was strongly against the avant-garde. They described the ideal as the model of high idealism, party spirit, and artist mastery are Soviet films, which demonstrate the richness of socialist life, are a mirror of the sentiments of Soviet man, consolidate the moral political union of the people, and mobilize them to achieve communism. This manifested in a particular format, the master narrative, which focuses on an exemplary individual, the positive hero, whose life story symbolically recapitulates the stages of historical progress as described in Marxist-Leninist theory. These films are frequently marked by distinctive themes and locations, contemporary interpretations of the Czechoslovak myth, the Western border. Many of these, however, had been present in Czechoslovak cinema since 1945 and earlier, just with new emphasis to a social and political project surrounding cinema that remained largely continuous throughout Czechoslovakia's first post-war decade. The adoption of socialist realism did the same for Czechoslovak cinema aesthetic and thematic concerns. Eventually, due to conflicts, the army school would be absorbed into FAMU, the Film and TV School of Academy of Performing Arts in Prague. This was the film school of the country and would birth the Czech New Wave. Most New Wave filmmakers had studied at this school. During the 60s, they made the films that comprised the wave. The films were distinct because they opposed the cinema that the party had been producing at the time. These filmmakers were not impressed with the pro-party films that occupied the cinema space. They were simply unrealistic and served the purpose of fulfilling the party's goal of socialist realism. The New Wave filmmakers instead made what we would call real realism, where they portrayed the actual reality of the country, doing stuff like, in the case of the Fireman's Ball, literally hired the actual fire department as actors. Or in other words, equally realism in Czechoslovak cinema in the early 1960s must be seen in the context of a reaction against socialist realism. Examples of the classic realist texts demonstrably at variance with everyday experience. In these circumstances, the desire to reflect everyday reality and promote discussion on everyday problems through the use of realist methods must be seen as progressive. Others took a mythical, surrealist approach, like Daisy's and Valerie in her Week of Wonders, which the state really despised. Interestingly, these films were produced by the state because of the nationalized industry, which meant filmmakers would have to submit plans for writing and go through the state's process for getting funding for them to be made. Filmmakers would submit plans and writing for the films that didn't reflect what they were actually going to make. They would obtain the budget from the state and essentially take the money and run. In other facets of the country, economics had been going downhill, and this became really apparent in the 60s. The country wasn't keeping up with other countries' post-war reconstruction, and people noticed this. Citizens were also upset with the censorship of media and freedom of press, and the party had obviously become authoritative. Writers at the time were even making copies of their work and passing it around by hand to avoid censorship from the state. People were upset, and they were demanding change and reform, which resulted in protests and pushbacks from citizens. Filmmakers reflected this in the sense that they were also tired of censorship and limited in what they could create, but they also reflected this in their films. Vera Hitolova's Daisies serves as a critique of authoritarianism, the patriarchy, and the Soviet style. Milos Forman's Loves of a Blonde portrayed the realism that the country lacked.
Ti to nedopovídá.
Ear by Karel Karkina emphasizes fear and paranoia felt under the party as it follows a couple as they realize their house has been bugged.
Žádný pojď sem, jdi tam, stůj tady, nepij, jo?
Co je s košarou? Vzali ho. Vzali taky Tondla, Klepáče a Schlesingera.
Jeromil Jiras' The Joke is a bold critique in which a man is expelled from the party for making a joke while illustrating the reality of life under the party, and was even called possibly the most shattering indictment of totalitarianism to come out of a communist country. The Czech New Wave had many others that played significant roles in critiquing the country and shifting the image that Czech cinema maintained under the state. Many would be immediately banned for decades, while some slipped by. Noting that many of the New Wave would be banned, they weren't actually received by audiences immediately, which in turn didn't act as a form of art and critique of the party that audiences could be inspired by or even reaffirmed by during the time. Instead, citizens would carry on without them, still continuing to push back against the government until some reform was witnessed during the Prague Spring of 1968, which of course was short-lived as it was quickly crushed and reversed by the Soviets and countries of the Warsaw Pact. Rather than these films influencing citizens and audiences, it was the citizens and audiences who influenced these films. They served as a mirror of how people felt under the state and during the post-war decline. It leaves one to wonder how audiences would have reacted had these films gotten the chance to release the citizens at their time of creation. Perhaps they would have been more powerful than what was intended for the party's socialist realism films. And these films instead would have served as their real powerful ideological tool. And without oppression and artistic oppression from Czechoslovakia's totalitarian government, the movement might have not happened at all, or at least not in the same form as it did. Looking back on it, the films from this wave serve as a time capsule of how the country was feeling at the time, perfectly encompassing the audience that never got to see the films at their creation. They also serve to represent the value of standing up against oppression and rules. Most of these artists were creating stuff that was very much against the rules, yet they did it anyway. The Czech New Wave is an inspiring example of disobedience against the state and worth taking a second look at, especially in times of uncertainty in the world.